afternoon. Welcome to SPY 25. I am very excited that you decided to join us today for this conversation about the role of AI in democratic societies. The topic is not only on top of a lot of researchers' minds, but it also strongly resonates with citizens. Hence, we are here in a full house. And this is why we want to organize opportunities like these for researchers and citizens to interact and to start a conversation together. This event is co-organized by the Philosophy Department of the University of Amsterdam, and specifically the minor Privacy Studies, as well as the AlgoSoc Consortium. AlgoSoc is short for Algorithmic Society, and this interdisciplinary consortium researches public values in the algorithmic society. My name is Annemijn Kwikkers, and I'm a PhD student in philosophy at AlgoSoc, and today I will be the moderator of this conversation. Today's conversation is about democracy and AI, about how democratic practice is increasingly intertwined with, or according to some, invaded by artificial intelligence. And today we try to shed some light on some of these applications, opportunities, and concerns. And the stakes are high. Democracy is a system of government in which power ultimately resides with us, the people. It is founded on the principles of political equality, individual freedom, and popular participation. In a democratic society, citizens have the right to vote, express their opinions, and influence public policy through free elections. And while governments are held accountable by the people and are expected to operate transparently, uphold the rule of law, and protect fundamental rights. Modern democracies have evolved to include representative institutions, checks and balances, and a vibrant civil society. And also today, democracy is widely regarded as the most legitimate form of governance, though it continues to face challenges such as political polarization, disinformation, corruption, and the erosion of trust in institutions. Despite these issues, democracy remains a powerful framework for promoting justice, equality, and human dignity in an increasing interconnected world. The rapid advancement of artificial intelligence is reshaping nearly every aspect of modern life, from how we work and communicate to how governments operate and make decisions. At the same time, the foundations of democracy, transparency, accountability, public participation, and equal rights face new challenges and opportunities in the digital age. As AI systems increasingly influence public policy, law enforcement, and electoral processes, urgent questions arise, such as, can AI strengthen democratic institutions, or does it risk undermining them? And how do we ensure that AI technologies align with democratic values rather than reinforce bias, surveillance, or authoritarian control? Today we will have a conversation with two speakers from the University of Amsterdam, after which we will invite you to participate in this conversation. We will first have a talk by Plixavra Vogiatsoglu. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Amsterdam Center for International Law and the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. She holds a PhD from the KU Leuven Center for IT and IP Law, where she remains an affiliated researcher. She is also a qualified lawyer in Greece. Her work critically assesses digital policy and governance frameworks, such as digital sovereignty and the impact of emerging technologies on rights, freedoms, and society. Her talk will be followed up by a talk by Hannes Kools. Hannes is an assistant professor in human factor in new technologies at the University of Amsterdam. He's also a Marie Curie scholar at the Digital Democracy Center at the University of Southern Denmark. And his research interests include AI, computational journalism, and news automation. He's also a research affiliate at the Culture, Communication, and Technology program of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And before, he was a PhD candidate at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Plixavra, let's get started.
this a little bit. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Anne-Maine, for the kind invitation. And it's very nice to be here and engage with you on this topic, which is, of course, quite broad. So what I will be focusing more, given that I have a legal background, is risks that are imposed and presented by artificial intelligence and how the regulation is meant to address these risks and whether they are specifically risks to fundamental rights, and in that way a broader impact on democracy through these artificial intelligence technologies. To do that, I will primarily focus on a set of technologies that are deployed in the field of security, and these are the so-called predictive policing technologies, explain some risks that are there, and then I will go through very broadly and briefly on how the AI Act, the new regulation, European regulation on artificial intelligence, how it is meant to address risks and how it is committed to safeguarding human rights. And I will conclude with the gaps we still see in the regulations. And I'm focusing on predictive policing because, first of all, that has been my focus of my dissertation, but also because the field of security is one that is extremely present and where we have seen a lot of exceptions in the AI Act. So what is predictive policing? We are missing the titles, but that's okay. Predictive policing is a sort of technologies that have gained a lot of attention the past decades, or a bit less. They are supposed to be analytical quantitative techniques that are deployed in order to identify individuals that could pose a threat. That means that they are making statistical predictions and trying to find within very large amounts of data potential correlations and patterns that could indicate a criminal behavior. By finding these patterns of potentially criminal behavior, they then identify the individuals that match this and that exhibit this behavior, and they guide security, or they are meant to guide security authorities towards identifying specific targets, people that they should, they are considered to be threatening, and security authorities should follow up on that. At least that is their promise. And while when I started my research, that was more a US thing, we do see it more and more happening, also being implemented in Europe. And to give an example of those kind of technologies, I will be focusing specifically on the automated suspicion of travelers as an example. Basically, every time we travel via plane, whether it is within the EU or even outside the EU, our data, everyone's data are being collected and they're shared with security authorities that then are tasked with processing these data and trying to identify people that could be linked to serious crimes. To do that, they deploy artificial intelligence tools, and those tools could rely first, on the one hand, on the basis of prior profiles that have been developed by security authorities on the basis of historical criminal data. For example, at border control, authorities might have created a profile where if a person is traveling light, only with cash, on the same day or from specific flagged countries, then they are considered potentially suspicious. And on the other hand, these new tools, they are meant to create their own criteria beyond these existing historical profiles and make, through the use of AI and the use of correlation and statistics, identify other types of criteria that could help security authorities in identifying the risks that are yet unknown to them. When people are flagged as potentially threatening, then there are several consequences. They can be subject to follow-up checks. They could be subject to further surveillance, put to lists, traveling lists, or even placed under traveling prohibitions. Of course, these types of technologies and these types of security measures can come with several risks and harms. First of all, as insofar as these technologies rely on historic data, it is very widely reported and very well known that AI tends to replicate historical biases, as it tends to focus on the same groups of people, and in that way, what goes in the AI comes out of the AI. It's a very well-known situation in which the racialized, gendered, classist assumptions tend to be replicated. Another important risk is how the understanding of criminal behavior and suspicious behavior is being eroded. We see a shift of focus from what is socioeconomic drivers of crime to a focus of addressing crime as a patternable phenomenon, one according to which criminals and individuals follow the same patterns of behavior, and therefore they can be caught. And it also comes with a focus within the security field of trying to control individuals through information and emerging technologies, and with the promise of cost efficiency and resource management. Therefore, the shift of focus is again moving away from the drivers of crime to cost management, for example. It is very difficult to assess whether these technologies yield the desired result. Can they actually deliver on their promise? What does it mean to predict and anticipate and forestall crime before it even happens? To stop a person from committing a crime? It is very difficult to see if those technologies can actually be effective. And at the moment, what metrics we do have are ones of very high false positive numbers. That means that a couple of years ago there was a report that 5 out of 6 people identified through these technologies at border control are falsely identified as potentially threatening. That could entail thousands of people being subject to checks for no reason. And of course, these impacts and these risks are suffered from the individual who may be fearful of traveling, who may be fearful of losing trust, as Anna mentioned earlier, to security authorities and to public authorities, while they also have consequences that are collective, that are societal, and they are cumulative. There's an overall risk of stigmatization of groups of people, and there's also a risk of expansiveness of these systems. As we see, the systems, without yet having confirmed their effectiveness, they are meant to be used not only on air flying, but also, for example, in trains, when traveling by train. And therefore, the risks to several fundamental rights that should be protected in order to enable our participation in a democratic society, like the right to privacy, the right to personal data protection and fair trial, the right to non-discrimination. Those are all rights that are likely to be infringed through these technologies. So here comes the AI Act. The EU Artificial Intelligence Act was adopted a year ago, and it is getting into force gradually in a layered manner. And as it is declared, the purpose of the AI Act is twofold. On the one hand, it is meant to improve the functioning of the internal markets and support innovation. That means that the goal is to have AI products circulating freely and responsibly within the EU market. And that is the first primary objective, because the EU is primarily having powers to ensure the good functioning of the market. But also, on the other hand, the AI Act is meant to safeguard democratic values, including democracy, the rule of law, and the safeguarding of human rights. This is reflected on how the AI Act is structured. And I'm sure you have seen this type of pyramid in one way or another, and we will see it again later by Hannes as well. The way that the AI Act is structured is that depending on the risk that the AI system is presenting, it might be subject to lower obligations and requirements, or it might be prohibited. And the reason why some practices are prohibited is because they are considered to be so abusive and harmful that they contradict EU values. And by EU values, we mean the values on the basis of which the European Union is founded, which is, again, democracy, respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Yet, we know that the AI Act has been subject to heavy lobbying and negotiations. There was extreme push by industry and by security authorities to include a lot of exceptions and carve out more room for security authorities to deploy artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, we have also seen an increasing adoption of security AI within both law enforcement and border control. Going then to those harmful practices that should be prohibited because they contradict our EU values, the AI Act has 7 specific practices that are deemed prohibited. However, the ones with the asterisk are only partially prohibited, but they are allowed in the field of security, in law enforcement and border control. What I was discussing about earlier, predictive policing, there has been a new prohibition on predictive policing, but that prohibition is very limited. It is only when the AI system is used in a completely standalone manner and a decision is taken against an individual without any human support. That is what is prohibited. When the AI system is used to support the security authorities, which is what would normally be the case, then it is allowed and it is considered a high-risk system. Similarly, we have emotional recognition technologies, for example, that are supposed to infer if a person is angry, happy, lying, on the basis of their facial reactions. Those are prohibited in education and workplace, but not for law enforcement and border control. Basically, the partially prohibited and a number of other technologies in the field of law enforcement and border control are then deemed high-risk AI systems. And what that means is that there are several requirements for high-risk AI systems in the regulation, including, for instance, the need to have a fundamental rights impact assessment, to have some documentation and transparency. Yet, there are a lot of exceptions, again, for law enforcement and border control when it comes to implementing these requirements and obligations. So perhaps, while on the one hand the regulatory framework provides several safeguards, it is also important to note that it legitimizes several technologies without there being sufficient justification of their effectiveness, of their actual use within society. And going back to the risks that I mentioned earlier on the automated suspicion of travelers, and the risks that I mentioned are there, then we see that the AI Act provides some safeguards, but those also fall short. So, for example, there is a risk management procedure whereby the company that develops the technology, they are meant to identify what are the risks and how to mitigate those risks. However, it is not foreseen that if the risk is too high, the system is retired. If the risk is too high, then there should be some appropriate measures, and the company that develops the technology just informs the security authority, for example, that would deploy it, that the risks are very high. When it comes to other requirements on data governance, on robustness and documentation, we have a lot of questions that are still remaining. For example, the AI Act says that the data sets should be representativeness. representative, but what does that mean in the field of security, where historic data tend to be focused on specific groups of people within society? How to avoid the feedback loop, the risk that the AI just keep on targeting the same groups of people. It is there as a safeguard, but there is no clarity as to how to actually implement it. And given how I mentioned earlier, there's an acceptance of very high false positives, even if we have the metrics that 5 out of 6 people might be falsely identified as threatening, that still leaves the security person that has to make a decision on that basis. And there we have the requirement of human oversight, but that we also know that there is also a lot of risks of people who, when they receive an output from the AI, they tend to agree with it when it confirms their own biases and assumptions. So automation bias is another risk that is quite difficult to address. And in the case of security, a security authority might be more prone to err on the side of caution rather than neglect an AI output that might be proven to be a wrong decision. And again, when it comes to the AI Act exceptions for security, in the case of law enforcement, when you have an AI output, you do not need a second person confirming the decision. When it comes to fundamental rights impact assessments, then there we don't have any, it's not foreseen that civil society and other external stakeholders who have a lot of knowledge on and a lot of contact with the people that are suffering the consequences from these technologies, those are not necessarily required to consult the entity developing the technology. The fundamental rights impact assessment for law enforcement and security does not need to be published. So if people suffer consequences, have no access to information about this technology. And it's not foreseen that the technology should be retired if the risks to fundamental rights are too high. And finally, even though the AI Act comes with certain rights, there's still a lot of questions as to what it means, for example, to have a meaningful explanation of how the AI came to this decision. How can you verify that this explanation is correct and it's complete and it's not an overload of information? How can it help a person who is affected in bringing a case, for example, or a complaint before a national authority? And ultimately, how can you remedy if you are subject to a biased AI decision, for example? There is no foreseement in what would it mean to rectify such a decision if you only discover it also quite later. Think of, for example, the Dutch child care benefit scandal, where it's still not entirely resolved. So to conclude, while we see in paper a very strong commitment on values and human rights and safeguarding our democracy, regulation is still falling quite short. And while the EU is presenting itself as a global actor, as the safeguard and the protector of human rights, and is seeking to assert its digital sovereignty within and abroad by promoting human rights as the global norm, the way that these shortcomings right now are seen in the law, they ultimately leave people that are in the most vulnerable situation the most exposed. So we need a lot of work in that regard still. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. I was also asked, thank you Annemijn for the kind invite, to shed my light on AI and democracy, and since this is a quite broad topic, I will be focusing a bit on the media perspective, and more concretely on principles, practices, and publics, because that is also a lot of the work that I'm doing now as part of the AI Media and Democracy Lab that is also based in Amsterdam. It's based at the University of Amsterdam, and it's an interdisciplinary lab. So we have people with legal backgrounds, we have people with computer science background, and then also communication science background. So I think starting with also a bit with what Plixavra was mentioning earlier, these principles are now there. There is regulation. There is actually a lot of regulation in place at this point. I think it's important to look at also how media is looking at that, at these principles. That I think is the first part that I want to talk to you about. The second part is more on these practices. So how are these principles actually translated now into practices? So I will be giving some examples of media organizations that are using AI as such, and also, well, some thoughts, some reflections when it comes to democracy. And then lastly, I will focus a bit on the the audience perspective, you and a lot of other people that, of course, have opinions when AI is being deployed in specific information systems. And then I thought of also showing you this, this figure basically mentioning that the public sphere is quite front and center when it comes to democracies. But what we see happening on the ground is that the public, the audience perspective is actually not as consulted as such. So starting with these principles, so also what Plixavra was already mentioning, we have now the AI Act. We also have other regulations in place. We have the Digital Services Act. We have the EMFA, the European Media Freedom Act. And basically, they also talk a bit about media and the use of AI within media organizations. And basically, what we see is that news organizations are linked to this limited risk, and their transparency is quite important. But at the same time, the AI Act also mentions, and I quote, obligation to report that text aimed at informing the public on matters of public interest has been artificially generated or manipulated. That's basically what it says. But then there is this exception, content that has undergone a human review process and falls under editorial responsibility. So basically, well, if we read this, a lot of news organizations, they are using AI already as we speak, but they are not being transparent because they also use this kind of exception when saying, well, there was editorial responsibility, there was oversight in there. So just to show that also in terms of the AI Act and the regulation that is there is a lot that news organizations actually need to fill in themselves. So a lot of these news organizations, like the public broadcaster here in the Netherlands, has come up with what they call principles, which are loosely also linked to this, this AI Act. So there's very much emphasis on self-regulation, and that is also, in general, a tradition that we see in the Netherlands, that there is a lot of emphasis on self-regulation. But again, at the same time, this AI is now so democratized that it is being used, and that it is also quite left to the individual news organizations how to deal with such systems. And that can be a problem. And that leads also to what I am now also investigating a lot, is what we call this principles to practices gap. It's actually some philosophers that have worked on this in Cambridge, specifically focus on, well, principles alone do not guarantee also ethical use of AI. And they basically also elaborated a few problems that come with when we think about this principles to practices gap in responsible AI. So what we see is that there are a lot of disciplines involved when it comes to thinking even about responsible AI. Because, as I said, it is now being democratized. So it's not something that used to be with the computer scientists. It's also now left with the journalists and the marketeers and a lot of other people within an organization. So therefore, it also scatters across the organization. There's also this many hands problem that these authors have been mentioning. That's basically also that a lot of the technology is just located in specific, locations in the organization. And that also alters it, to a certain extent, our information system, and it also increasingly is influencing where information is going and moving within a democracy. And I will make that a bit more tangible as well on how this is exactly being used in news organizations. And also when I talk about AI deployment, I talk about, well, to a certain extent, recommender systems, but also, of course, now large language models. So here I'm showing one practice, and this is a very prominent news organization in the Netherlands that basically have built their own large language model tool. What you can see on the slide is basically the content management system that they have, and they have added an extra layer, a large language model layer, that is now being used for a writing tool, but it's also being used to summarize articles, so to summarize information. And they basically use this AI throughout their system. So it is being implemented since the beginning of this year, and it's now being implemented throughout this whole CMS system. So this AI is being used to a certain extent, so that was also what I was saying earlier with, you have these principles in there, but then you have individuals also engaging with these technologies, and they have also different levels of what you could call AI literacy. And that could also problematize, basically, where information is going. And a lot of the arguments around this kind of implementation when it comes to this large language model is, of course, this efficiency and efficiency gains. And this is not something new. This is something that when I was doing my PhD a couple of years ago, when ChatGPT was not even a thing, these efficiency gains were also a lot mentioned by, upper management to say, okay, we need these technologies actually to enhance specific processes in a news organization. And this is something that we see happening. But then, of course, on the other hand, if you look at the audience, when we tell people that it is being used, but this organization is not transparent towards the bigger audience, that can even erode the trust, or it can actually fuel distrust also in news organizations. And that can put even more pressure on sometimes our already precarious democracies. Another example of these practices, it's basically that here, I said AI is becoming business as usual in the sense that we now have already over 3 years ChatGPT. So this business as usual is basically also showing that it is being implemented and it's not being only left to the computer scientists. So it is being implemented and it is being used. And that's actually also, I think, some sort of thumb rule when it comes to technologies. When these technologies are there, they will also be used. And another example that I have here is basically it's also now already being used to write regional articles. And back then, I mean, before ChatGPT was a thing, this was still called template journalism, but now it's basically what it does, very concretely, it scrapes specific websites. So it's getting information from specific websites overnight mostly, and then it shows the editor in the morning some suggestions also to, have this article or another article, regional article, to be published in the morning. So there is still a human involved, but to a certain extent, there are a lot of questions being or need to be asked when it comes to this form of AI deployment in news organizations. And I think also, interestingly, Plixavra just talked about, this predictive policing. If we look at the AI Act, we basically see that news organizations are linked to limited risk. And my point is there that it is linked to limited risk, but it can also really have detrimental effects. So there are also a lot of risks involved that could even be seen as also higher forms of risk because, it is a technology that is increasingly also influencing, how a specific article is even being written or even visualized. And then another example is, for example, the public broadcaster is also increasingly investing in AI, new forms of AI, sometimes also simplifying specific content because people find it too hard to read this content in that sense. So there is a lot of experimentation still, but there is also inherently institutionalization of these technologies across a news organization. So it's really also part of a broader strategy, I would say. Now, coming to publics, and I want to make clear that publics is different than audiences, but I think you might wonder where is the audience in this and what does the audience think of this. And if you look even at the regulation, so coming back to the regulation, to the AI Act, to the Digital Services Act, a lot of mentions, when the audience is mentioned, they mention information needs and the information needs of audiences. But we've also seen that even scholarly work has not always been focused on these audience needs, but they are quite vital also for the functioning of our democracies. When we also as a society think, okay, this AI use now by a lot of news organizations, do we find this okay that it is being deployed in such a manner? And that's also, I think, one of the reasons sometimes why news organizations are not transparent, because they think that this trust that they see eroding might even erode further if, the general public would know more on how these technologies are actually being deployed. So I was mentioning this principles to practices gap, but I actually argue that we really have this principles, practices, and publics gap. And I think also bringing that public's perspective more into the discussion when we talk about AI and news and democracy, that is really an essential key for the deployment of such technologies. Actually, some of the work that has looked at this audience perspective, it's quite interesting. Here, this was a study done by the Reuters Institute from Oxford University. So they asked in 6 different countries how people would react, or how basically, how much do you trust or distrust each of the following to make responsible use of generative AI. And what you see is that people have high trust in science and healthcare, so that AI is being used in these sectors. But then if you look at news media, and you compare it also to social media companies, a lot of people put news media actually on the same foot as social media companies, which is, quite problematic that a lot of audiences now already distrust the fact that AI is being used in news media. And I also argue that because these news organizations are now not transparent, and there will be maybe problems or errors or factual errors involved in this AI deployment, I really believe that this might even disrupt or erode the trust in news organizations even more. All right. Summing up, and I think also we will have a discussion, so I wanted to leave you with maybe some more questions and answers. I'm sorry to do this. Taking these 3 perspectives, so this principles, practices, and publics. So I think the first part, the principles part, I think for now also a lot of these news organizations, but even organizations in general, they have focused on these principles, but it's a very static approach. So what is in these principles is basically that they will be transparent, that there will always be a human in the loop. But how do you translate that into practice? And I also really believe that this requires a more dynamic approach rather than a static one. But these documents, these principles that these news organizations have put out, they are quite static in essence. And I think when we think about questions of AI and democracy, but also responsible AI use, we really need a more dynamic approach. And I'm also curious to hear your thoughts about that. The second part is this practices part, and this moving fast and break things philosophy that a lot of these news organizations have also result in irresponsible AI uses. So the tool that I showed you before from DPG Media, this has also already led to factual errors in that regard. So it also leads to irresponsible AI uses, and that will, of course, or might potentially trigger a backfire effect from the audiences. And then lastly, the public's perspective, yeah, there is, I believe, a democratic deficit if audiences' information needs are insufficiently, well, considered in AI practices. But I also, well, am reflecting on how do we organize such processes that we get these information needs, that we can map also these information needs for audiences. And I think by, at least from my perspective, looking from these three different angles, I think we can also more critically reflect on how AI should and could be used in our modern democracies, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Hannes and Plixavra, for your very interesting talks today. I thought it was very nice that Plixavra pointed to some of the high-risk application of AI, whereas Hannes addressed more the lower-risk application of AI in democratic societies. I also think that you both made a very convincing argument that there are good reasons for concerns. At the same time, I want to press you, both of you maybe a little bit. I think there is something about AI that draws us in. It is attractive, it's efficient, it's shiny, it has computational power that human beings simply cannot meet. It has an ability to make connections. It might have some ability to prevent future crime or to deliver politically relevant news to readers more quickly. And my question, I guess, to both of you is, like, how should we deal with the attractiveness of AI? Should we push back? Should we accept a slower pace? Should we have more regulation? And I was just wondering, what do you think?
Okay, thanks for the question. I'm still erring on the pushing back side. So, for example, when it comes to predictive policing, those technologies were originally, or they come from forecasting the weather. But from forecasting weather to identifying criminals, there is a very, very broad room for error. So the shininess, the effectiveness, even the cost and resource management, will it actually help security authorities diminish personnel or manage with large amounts of data when they still need to comply with so many obligations and they need to have verification by a human in the loop and need to figure out what a human in the loop is, need to train the humans to understand and interpret, need to check that there is no automation bias, and so on. I'm not fully convinced, especially in this field. I think perhaps and I was quite shocked to see how trust there was in military and law enforcement in the diagram you show. That ranked pretty high. And I'm sure there are some applications where this ability to condense large amounts of data into specific conclusions will be helpful. But perhaps where we're dealing with the most precarious situations of people and most vulnerable situations for people, then I would indeed go more towards the side of slowing down.
Yeah, I think for me, when reflecting, of course, on news media, when you take the AI Act as a framework, it is indeed limited risk. So therefore, we're not talking about predictive policing, but there's, of course, also a lot of bias involved in these systems, right? And a lot of times when I talk with news organizations, I basically also ask them, like, yeah, but what kind of problem are you actually trying to solve with these AI technologies? And then they look at me and they're like, yeah, but I mean, also our competitors are doing it, so why shouldn't we also jump on that train? So I think a lot of the narratives and the PR around AI also helps in this, you know, attractiveness and the fact that people, organizations need to do something with these technologies. So I also really think that, yeah, by critically reflecting on, okay, is this actually going to solve a problem? That might also already elaborate specific discussions within an organization when it comes to AI deployment. But I think indeed it is very attractive, this technology, and we also have the feeling that we need to do something with it. And to a certain extent, I mean, I have been quite critical also in my presentation, but there can be also upsides of using it. But now I think the whole responsible AI discussion, at least from the organizations that I am speaking with, is being treated as an afterthought. And I also actually brought a book which basically I can very much recommend it. It's called Computing Taste by Nick Seaver. He's an anthropologist, and what he describes, well, he had a paper where he said, okay, recommender systems, they're actually, I compare them with traps. So he looks at traps and how we are entrapped in specific things, and then he uses specific forms of traps, so how specific animals are being trapped. And he also makes the same argument that, I mean, we humans are very curious and we want to find out specific things, and that I think is also the appeal of, you know, chatting with these large language models. And I think, yeah, this attractiveness precedes the traps, or the traps that we're sometimes in a certain aspect. And it's an interesting, I think, comparison, but it's, yeah, I think it's a good way also of thinking about specific technologies in that sense. So more critically also assessing that, I would say, yeah.
Yes, the excitement, but also maybe the perceived need of AI can also be very human, actually, for us. Thanks both of you. I'm sure there are also a lot of questions from your side. We are also very eager to know what you're thinking of and how these topics resonate with other researchers. So I would like to open up the floor for questions. Please keep your questions short and tight so we can address as many questions as possible. I think this lady here in front has a question. We will give you a microphone. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for these wonderful presentations and moderation. Could you tell us some more about who drives the development of AI, who is financing it principally, and what the military applications are, particularly in the conflict zones we are witnessing nowadays?
Let me start by saying that the AI Act does not apply to national security, military, and defense. So all this regulatory perspective, it has one of the biggest exceptions being military. Yes. Then you're talking about the broader military tech complex, and yes, we do have specific countries and companies that push forward artificial intelligence, but that is quite a very broad question, I think. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of more specific, but yeah.
I hear you say that within the EU, this type of deployment
there is no regulation, so it's also quite difficult to keep track of that.
But I think it's also a good point that you're making, right? It's a bit this question also, yeah, who is funding specific AI? Of course, we know the big tech, and I think also with the recent developments, it really shows that even a lot of organizations, governments are very dependent on these big tech companies. So following the money, I think, can help. And then something else that I was thinking of your question, I think, yeah, these companies also have a lot of power in lobbying specific regulation. So, for example, the AI Act, I was involved in a process basically also thinking, how do we translate the AI Act into a more code of practice? And what you there also have seen, there were a lot of stakeholders involved, because that was also from the European perspective, we need to involve more stakeholders. And there again, there were a lot of big tech companies who were involved in that process and had a lot of things to say about, you know, how to translate that into practice. So I think, yeah, following the money can definitely help. But we also see in the news all these investments, right, being made in AI. So the question of, well, is AI deployment, is that ethically? I think that's a central question for our democracies. But I think also interesting questions are even where is AI, right? Where are the data centers, these kind of things? And that's something also as a society that we need to keep on asking for, where specific data centers will be, because it again implies, yeah, specific dependencies in there. But indeed, it's a bit of a broad question, I would say, yeah.
And maybe to add that, I think the exception was carved out in order to have more development and deployment in Europe. So I think we will see it increasingly.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to continue with a question here in the front.
Hello. When I talk to people who are a little more right-leaning, they proclaim that the EU Act will slow us down, will leave us beholden to China and America, who will have companies that have moved at a faster pace. Could you steelman their arguments and then propose a way in which perhaps the EU's ideals for AI control could spread to the rest of the world?
Another very broad question.
Do you want to maybe pick up a couple? Or? Okay. I think that if our goal is to compete US and China, then we have to get rid of regulation, yes. But is that our goal? Maybe our goal should be to think alternatively about artificial intelligence, the ethical questions, the responsible questions. Do we want it in the military? Do we want it in our news media? Where are data centers? Are they here, or are we pushing them elsewhere? Which resources are we draining to have AI and to deploy AI? So the critics of the regulation, or regulation is slowing down innovation. First of all, regulation is not that strict. We're talking about quite basic transparency, logging requirements, technical documentation. There are so many questions into the implementation of it all. There are exceptions also for research in the AI Act, so innovation can fall under that. but I see these two sides. I don't think the regulation is really stopping, and I'm not sure if our goal should be to fully compete in that same manner.
Yeah, I think it's an often heard argument, right? That also regulation might obscure AI deployment or even AI innovation. I don't necessarily believe in it, because I think also regulation really helps. I mean, when we drive cars, the safety of the car is also by that you can stop, right? So in that sense, this also was through regulation being done. So I think also that we need it at least to have it ethically in there. But I think also this whole narrative of an AI race, that we're in an AI race, there's no such thing as an AI race, in my opinion, because then it would also apply that there is a finish line. Basically, now we have this technology and we need to cope with it. So in that sense, a lot of media, in my opinion at least, are also framing it in a way that we are indeed in a race and that there can only be one winner. But yeah, to be honest, if you now look at all the regulation that is coming, if you take the European Media Freedom Act, at least I'm not a lawyer, but I have a lot of lawyer friends, they basically, it will basically also help to put more transparency into all the systems that news organizations are using. So news organizations will also need to be thinking about actually being transparent and more open towards even also other things on how they are tracking what you're reading and these kind of things. So it can also lead to a broader discussion, at least that's what I hope, in how these technologies could and should be used in our democracies.
Yeah, thank you very much. Josh?
Hi. So in your first question, or in the first question, a bit was suggested about following the money. So maybe a bit to harp a bit more on that. Since algorithms increasingly influence not only how news is produced, but also to what gets prioritized to what extent, do power structures like ownership, for example, or editorial goals shape the use of AI in these journalism platforms? And can these influences then be explained to the public in the context of democratic accountability? So maybe an example you could discuss is that Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. He could have some like personal or general things that he would want to say. Is this also included in the AI use, or?
So you're saying that Jeff Bezos has a specific agenda, and then he would also
could that happen? Is basically because there's do these power structures have influence on the use of AI in the journalistic platforms?
Yeah, I think inherently, if you look also at how specific technologies are being deployed, it really shows that, the upper management is quite keen to implement specific technologies, and that also really leads to then, strange scenarios in the sense that journalists suddenly find out that there is an AI system in their software, and that they didn't really ask for such a software. So in that sense, it is often quite linked to power structures and how it is being implemented, because, I mean, to be honest, these technologies that I showed in the slides, this is just part of a broader strategy to, produce more content and have less people or humans in the loop in that sense. So indeed, like I said before, these technologies are there and they are being used to a certain end, and they will definitely make mistakes and they will definitely make factual errors in that regard. But yeah, there's always a specific agenda, at least linked to that, to have indeed, on the argument of efficiency and these kind of things in there. So, yeah, I don't know if it really answers your question, but I think that the upper management, they're always buying into a specific agenda and a specific strategy. And right now, this is very much, AI deployment and doing something with AI, and also this being framed as there's just one way, namely more AI, but there are also alternatives. And I think also what Blixa was saying earlier, that's even thinking about, where is it, and should we engage with it even, and thinking also about alternative technologies in that regard, is very much something that I think also needs to be even more focus of the debate right now, although it has been changing, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, the idea that company owners could have their own agenda. Is that something that you also see in the policing companies, or is it not as much of a risk there?
I haven't had the type of work of engaging directly with the security authorities in an empirical manner, but for sure, most authorities don't develop their technologies in-house. It is procured or bought. For example, you had mentioned Clearview before when you entered. That is an American company that scraped data from all over the internet illegally and then sold its system to police in Europe. And even though it's been heavily fined, it actually has not paid the fines. So for sure, who develops the technology will play a very big role. And I think then our goal with regulation is also to ensure some sort of procurement rules and this idea of, when the product is placed in the market. When it comes to Clearview AI, there was a specific prohibition addressed to Clearview. So there was some attempt to try to mitigate that power dynamic.
Right, so we see that in different sectors, actually. Yeah. Next question for Beate. We need a microphone for the people at home.
Thanks very much. I actually want to come back to the first concept of the two concepts mentioned in the title, the democracy, because Blixa, the way you presented the AI Act was more as a threat for individual freedoms. And also in the second talk, the focus was on individual freedoms as, which are very important in liberalism. But where exactly is democracy in danger? So where would you say, for instance, with one question about who will be first with AI is, I think, a legitimate question if you don't really value democracy, because authoritarian societies will be far more efficient in, giving money to the right companies, as is happening in the US already. So where comes democracy in?
Well, as I tried to highlight, indeed, a lot of fundamental rights are in principle individual rights, but actually they affect groups. So if we're talking about an AI that's developed in police or border control, it targets usually specific groups of people, which usually also suffer and have less means to contest these decisions. So that is one way where democratic values can be at harm. Even if we talk about the individual, if we have the chilling effect of people being fearful of surveillance, there again, that could create a way of losing trust, of not believing in the democratic process, of not participating in democratic processes. If you have surveillance and drones every time you go on a protest, then you are becoming afraid individually, but then has consequences for society and democracy at large. And when I refer to the very heavy lobbying, I think that is also very indicative of our democracy. This was a legislation where you had companies and specific actors leading one of the biggest legislative instruments, and what was presented as a very big for democracy in the EU comes in fact with many gaps. So the legitimacy of the democratic process is also questionable here.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, if we think about media, let me give an example. So the BBC, they are investing in recommender systems. And when you talk with the people that work on these recommender systems, they use specific metrics to evaluate if the recommender system is effective. And the golden standard for that recommender system is engagement, so if people click on something. And of course, that is not, I would say, necessarily a democratic value. You could think of other metrics like diversity, or, yeah. So, well, the thing is that often these democratic values are not part of even the design of such system. So these recommender systems, they are optimized for engagement, but you could also say, well, for example, diversity of opinions, that is part of a democracy, that you have a debate, that you... So in that sense, I would say that here democracy could also be at stake, that if you take a recommender system or a large language model, if it is being optimized only for engagement, then yeah, we might just give audiences what they just want and not opinions that are contradicting their views or these kind of things. And I think it's also a bit to what Plixavra was saying, is that basically it is indeed individual, but it can have really trickle-down effects on the larger democracy. And I mean, if you have also a large language model that is just being used a lot within a news organization, that can also influence how people view specific topics even. So in that sense, I really think that maybe there's not a direct link if it comes to the individual when they're using such technologies, but it can indeed have broader effects on the long term.
Could even have different effects, right, on the level of the individual and the level of the collective, if I understood you correctly. Thank you for your question. We have 2 more questions here. Maybe we can collect them.
Just the BBC example has been given. Just on that, upon that example, I can raise the issue of information needs you highlighted in your presentation. My question is, Hannes, by the way. Having said that, you know, the information needs, do they implicate the needs of the society or different societies, clusters or segments, for example, in terms of the demographical needs or age-appropriate needs or something like that? Or do they imply kind of democratic values or maybe they're raising their needs in terms of being more powerful in terms of their rights and opportunities? What do they mean? I mean, information needs might imply also public service broadcasting issues, you might know, of course. I mean, it is a little bit vague, I mean, just in the first instance, at least to me. Could you elaborate on that, please? Thank you.
Maybe we do this question first and then collect the other one.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. Information needs, when they are also described in regulation, they're not made very specific, right? So I can give an example on how we have been looking at information needs. We've also looked at transparency and the whole challenge of transparency when it comes to AI use. What is a good amount of information when you disclose the use of AI on an article level? How should that look like? Is that what kind of information also as a citizen would you need to be informed and not be, distrusting the content? Because basically you see a lot of these studies where you have a logo, for example, on an article saying that AI was being used. Is that something that is sufficient also for information needs from specific groups that you're also saying? So maybe younger people might have completely other information needs than older people. I think right now we don't really know that, but I think looking at these different clusters, at younger people, at maybe older people, different demographics, I think we might also learn a bit more on, you know, what are these information needs, and then coming back to that example of transparency, yeah, what is the right amount of information then that needs to be disclosed when such technology is being used? Is it a logo? Is it one sentence? Is it a longer statement in that sense? So that could be a very concrete way in looking and operationalizing what specific information needs would be from the audience in order that they trust maybe the content still.
Then do they actually get involved in the process of operationalization?
Of course, yeah. I actually forgot to say, so we did focus groups. So we did group interviews with specific demographics, and then also asked about, so we gave them specific, what we then call stimuli, and then showed them different levels of transparency, and then we let them also reflect on, okay, what would be good or sufficient information for you. And now we're working also on an experiment where we also will work with some eye tracking to look at the specific information needs. But if you're interested, I can talk a bit more about that after, yeah.
Then we have a question for that lady in the center.
So I'm trying to get my thoughts together here, but one of the issues that I know we had in the United States over the last 3 elections has been misinformation, and some of that is generated by AI. And I'm wondering, particularly for media, and this has created huge issues for comprehension of you know, news events and that kind of thing, because people do start to distrust the news, and sometimes for very, very good reason. So how do we make sure that the information that is being delivered has passed muster beyond one person? You know what I mean? Beyond an editor. Because I could see a situation where information becomes kind of recursive with AI. Does that make sense? So a lie gets spread, and then it gets spread, and then it becomes fact because it's been spread so many times. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, your question. Yeah, I think a lot of angles to that, right? But you could also even question if the technology then is really the actual amplifier. Well, it's humans who share it, right? And there has been research on spreading of misinformation and these kind of things, and you basically see that it indeed gets amplified quite quickly. But I sometimes also think if, the AI technology, I mean, it might happen more, but to push back on that a little bit, if we look at all the elections that we had last year, like the major election year, we basically have seen not that many messages like misinformation, because a lot of experts actually warned for these effects, that there might be, because of the democratization of AI, that there might be even more misinformation and fake messages being shared. But we haven't seen that. So maybe also as scholars, as doing research, we're maybe also sometimes underestimating this in general, this spread of misinformation. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think to a certain point, what you said about, that it's being checked by an editor, a lot of times when you talk with news organizations, they now want to have this AI and move faster, but they sometimes tend to forget that indeed they have principles that already say, okay, we need to fact check things 2 or 3 times. It's just weird that some organizations then say, no, we need to do it more fast, but then they're also obfuscating their own mission to a certain extent. And I think we just need to stay calm and, reflect on these technologies in a democratic way. Yeah.
I am carefully looking at the time. I think we have one more first question here in the front. I'll give the final question to you there.
Thank you. Last but not least. So what you just said about the fact that there is the importance of fact-checking. From these, well, my mother was a journalist, so I think I can say that I don't trust journalists in general. In general, I mean, you have seen in the last century that information through journal, through magazine, to news, has become less and less and less reliable because less and less fact-checking. AI, at this point, is just one more step in that direction. So is the problem the AI or the lack of fact-checking, of critical thinking by the people that just eat whatever is presented to them? So I really fear that aren't we being scared by AI, but we should be scared in a more broad way from ourselves.
I think we can actually ask your question to both our speakers. Like, is the problem in the technology, or are we human beings not critical enough of how we deploy the technologies? Maybe Plixavra first.
Thank you for the final question. I think both. For sure, AI is an additional step because if we think about a few years ago with COVID, it was not only AI where people were vehemently believing that it was all a hack. So for sure, it's also people. It's also fact-checking. It's also just people wanting or not wanting to believe. But I would still warn also about AI because it's so much spread, as Hannes also mentioned. It has been democratized. Anyone can use it. And if we go back to the power dynamics and who controls what, if we think about shadow banning and the voices of people who are being silenced and certain amount of information never reaches the broader audience, or Meta right now wanting to use everyone's interactions with AI to develop their own AI and further their own interests. These are major players. These are a handful of billionaires that control a very large amount of information. Young people, myself, oftentimes get my news from social media, and that's very wrong, and I know it. And who owns a social media? The very few people. So yeah, for sure it would be great if we're all more critical, but we also should think of the role of AI in this.
Yeah, thank you for your question, the final question. Very small question. I agree with Plixavra that I think it's both, and I really also think that, and I hope at least, that the debate on AI deployment is being broadened. So that's also why I mentioned this audience perspective. The audience is quite lacking when it comes to, regulation, when it comes to, even in my own ballpark, the news organizations. And I think we really need to have also a broader discussion into what kind of problem are we indeed solving with all these AI systems. If it's only for efficiency, then also from a democratic point of view, why are we doing that? And then linked to that is the problem, the technology. I think the whole dependency question that also the lady in the front row asked, like, follow the money. I think also as a society we need to have this debate more, but we also, I think, need to start thinking about alternative infrastructures, technological infrastructures. And here in the Netherlands now they're building GPT-NL, which is the Dutch equivalent of ChatGPT, or at least it's going to be the Dutch large language model. And I think, coming back also to where is AI, that is something that, at least for now, I'm seeing also in news organizations that is changing, that people are also open to listen more to this whole procurement dilemma. Where do we actually procure our technologies? Where does the data come from? Where is this company? What is the agenda of that company? And I think that is really something that will also increase and be more prominent, will be put more prominently on the agenda. And that also, maybe also, concluding a bit on a hopeful note, that stems me hopeful in the sense that we are now being aware a bit more on, in what kind of traps we are, the traps of big tech in that sense, and that we can maybe reflect on specific alternatives, Dutch alternatives, but also EU alternatives. So I think that would be my answer.
Thank you. There is a future, I hear. I know that there are still more questions, but unfortunately we have come to the end of this program, at least to the formal part. But obviously this conversation is not over. And in fact, we will continue our conversation right here with all of you if you want to join over drinks. For now, I would like to say again, thank you for Spui 25 for hosting us, and to Blik Safra and Hannes for your very insightful and inspiring talks today. And thank you.
Thank you. Een evenement over technologie en dan... Ja, natuurlijk.